aware of how late in the day it is, and I know some of you must be double parked, so I'll make this as succinct as possible. This morning's discussion caused me to wonder how much we would understand about electricity if our method of studying it was to stand on the tops of high hills and wait to be struck by lightning. It seems to me that's sort of the position that we're in vis-a-vis the UFOs. We have no real theory. We have conjectures. We have fiercely defended hypotheses, but we have very little that is concrete to go on. It's almost as though the issue of the UFO were an onion, and as we peel the layers of the onion, we discover when we get to the center that there is nothing there whatsoever left. It reminds me that if you cross an onion with a UFO, what you get is a flying saucer that brings tears to your eyes. And so what I would like to do is, just based on the notes I took today, to review what the options available to us are in terms of trying to get some kind of intellectual handle on this phenomenon, and I'll move through them rather quickly. One possibility that I suppose is now out of fashion because it wasn't mentioned here today, other than what Jacques said about ball lightning and plasmas, is that the UFOs are somehow natural phenomena, perhaps piezoelectric forces that have an ability to interact with the delicate electrochemical machinery of the human nervous system to create an impression of hallucination or visitation or abduction. That's one possibility. The more serious contenders as explanations, I think, fall into three categories. Is it us? Are we being visited? Or is there another tenant in the building that we are unaware of? And my own feeling about this tends to vacillate. I have had contact experiences. I have seen a UFO very close. I have met with entities from other dimensions, and it has not impelled me to take a strong position. I've paid very close attention when these experiences were happening to me, and there always seem to be loose ends that argue against whatever hypothesis seems currently most attractive. And though Jacques didn't mention it today, I recall in his book, The Invisible College, he stressed the absurdity that seems to attend the contact experience, that if the contactee will truly tell the unvarnished truth, then there will be elements in the story which will make the contactee look like a moron. In other words, the invalidation of the experience is an inimical part of its structure, almost as though the entities were saying, well, you may tell this story if you wish, but if you tell it truthfully, you'll be taken for a fool. Well, there's nothing wrong with being taken for a fool, except that it does seal the phenomenon rather nicely away from the very sober ladies and gentlemen who are making their careers in some branch of science. They are not interested in investigating the kinky, the anecdotal, the possibly pathological. In preparation for this conference, I reread Carl Jung's book, published in 1954, called Flying Saucers, A Modern Myth of Things Seen in the Sky. And to my mind, no one has really gone beyond Jung. He understood very clearly that saying that something is a denizen of the psychic realm no way precludes its also having efficacious force in the physical realm through the phenomenon which he called synchronicity. Some of the points which Jacques made today about the nature of the medical examinations that are reported, they are absurd. They are unnecessary to be performed at our level of technology, let alone any future more advanced level that we might be asked to believe in. So if the UFO phenomenon is something that is coming from us, then what is it, and what is it for? And I've given a good deal of thought to this question over the years because I tend to lean toward the notion that the UFO problem, like many subtle problems, is haunted by our own naivete concerning language. If I were to randomly choose, and don't worry, I shan't, 5 of you to come up here, and each one of you would have 40 seconds to explain to the rest of us what an atom is, it would be preposterous. None of us know. I doubt there's a person in this room who can give an account of the atom that tallies with the quote-unquote orthodox description of the atom. So there is a curious fuzziness about the most mundane parts of reality when we really attempt to magnify and understand them in the clear light of consciousness. How much more ambiguity there is then, naturally, attendant upon the examination of any kind of phenomena which are rare or tend to be fringy. So it isn't a matter of achieving consensus over the UFO. We can't even achieve consensus about what constitutes a decent souffle. So this passionate desire to drag us all under the umbrella of a single explanation is, I think, missing the point. To my mind, if the UFO phenomena is something arising out of the superego of the human psychic organization, then we should ask why. What is it doing? And I don't want to sound like a public relations agent for Jacques Vallée, but to my mind, with the exception of Jung, Jacques is the only commentator on the phenomenon who has really pushed the frontier back. To my mind, in The Invisible College, when Vallée says, in looking at the effect, not asking the question, what is it, but what does it do, you very quickly see what the flying saucers are doing. What they are doing is eroding faith in science. They are an antidote to the scientific paradigm that has evolved over the past 400 years and which has led us to the brink of global catastrophe. So the notion being developed here is that within the structure of the human psyche, there is something like a governor, something like a monitoring circuit, which when a society begins to evolve in a pathological or lethal direction, phenomena can be induced not by the egos of men and women, not by their institutions, but by the overmind, the collectivity of the human species. Phenomena can be induced which are so corrosive to the ideologies currently in place that their underpinnings are cut away, their validity is called into question, and their programs for social development and control are invalidated and destroyed. Now, a perfect example of this is the rise of infant Christianity. If you'll cast your mind back to the situation in the early years of the Christian era, and imagine the mentality of a Roman aristocrat, a person of power in Roman society. Their physics is drawn from democracy and atomism. In other words, they are thoroughgoing materialists. Their social theory is drawn from Epictetus and Plato. They are, in fact, extremely modern people by our own standards. However, among the gardeners and kitchen help and stable boys, there is news of a momentous event in the Middle East. A Jewish rabbi has triumphed over death and risen after 3 days in the tomb. Should the master of a Roman household have caught wind of this kind of superstitious talk among the help, he would have just dismissed it with a sneer. What a preposterous idea. And it is a preposterous idea. Nevertheless, the fact that an idea is preposterous has never held it back from making zealous converts. And within 120 years after the Annunciation of the birth of Christianity, its missionaries were beating on the gates of Rome, attempting to convert the emperor. Now I see a similar situation in the modern context, that rationalism, scientific technology, which began and came out of the scholasticism of the Middle Ages and the quite legitimate wish to glorify God through an appreciation of His natural world, turned into a kind of demonic pact, a kind of descent into the underworld, a nekeia, if you will, leading to the present cultural and political impasse that involves massive stockpiles of atomic weapons, huge propagandized populations cut off from any knowledge of their real histories, male-dominated organizations plying their message of lethal destruction and inevitable historical advance. And into this situation comes suddenly an anomaly, something which cannot be explained. I believe that that is the purpose of the UFO, to inject uncertainty into the male-dominated, paternalistic, rational, solar myth under which we are suffering. So, I suppose if you had to categorize this point of view, you would say I'm taking a depth psychological, psychoanalytic point of view. What I'm saying is that the UFO is nothing more than an assertion of herself by the goddess into history, saying to science and paternalistically governed and driven organizations, you have gone far enough. We are going to turn the world upside down. Your science is going to be shown up for what it is, nothing more than a pleasant metaphor usefully extrapolated into the production of toys for healthy children. That's what science is good for. It is not some meta-theory at whose feet every point of view from astrology to acupressure to channeling need be laid to have the hand of science announce thumbs up or thumbs down. Now, there is another possibility which can be dovetailed into the first. It is that it is not so much the oversoul or the superego of the human species which is responsible for stopping scientific masculine paternalism in its tracks, but rather that, unbeknownst to self-absorbed and myopic human beings, we have always shared, or at least for a very long period of time, have shared this planet with an other, another intelligent species, another entity, which may have been perfectly content to allow us to abide in our ignorance of its presence until the point where it came to its awareness that our style was toxifying, ruining, raping, and perverting the planet. And at that point, this thing springs into action with similar end results as the previous scenario, the invocation of the superego. It's astonishing to me that in the 45 years that the UFO, are we being visited question has been kicked around, I have never seen in any UFO book or publication the suggestion made that if we believe we are being visited by organic, intelligent life forms from some other dimension or place in the galaxy, then we should very, very thoroughly examine the ecology of this planet for traces of its presence. What assurance do we have that the several million life forms that we know to exist on this planet all evolved here? Do we have any assurance? There are ways to gain that assurance by doing comparative DNA sequencing and this sort of thing. Some of you may know my own position, or one of my positions, which is that plants and fungi containing psychoactive compounds are extremely viable candidates for extraterrestrial intruders into the environment of this planet. And this is not to put down Whitley's story, which is a very interesting story, but had he prefaced his story with the comment that before it all happened he took 5 grams of mushrooms, I doubt he could have sold it to his mother. Because in the world where mushrooms and other psychedelic plants are imbibed, such stories are commonplace. It's no big deal. So I'm always amused by UFO investigators and compilers of data who will tell you, well, the first thing we did is we got rid of all the stories told by anybody who was intoxicated on anything. It seems to me that move has probably absolutely precluded any possibility of understanding what is going on. You see, culture is something that we wear like clothes, and we're very much at ease with culture. Our mind is very much at ease with culture, and we gather the language of a given culture around us. Culture is the mind unperturbed. When a shaman or an ecstatic visionary goes into the wilderness and through ordeal or yogic practice or breath control or the taking of a psychoactive substance perturbs the mind, then we see what the mind is out naked, undressed from the clothing of language and convention. That's why I've made this point over and over again. There will not be a serious discussion of the origin of UFOs, or for that matter, of the nature of consciousness itself, until we leave the utterly culture-bound, provincial, and hick-like attitude that science has foisted on us about perturbing the mind. Without the use of psychedelic substances, I think solving the UFO dilemma is going to be as thankless a task as attempting to understand the nature of the universe without availing yourself of the use of a telescope. It is simply tying our hands behind our backs. Now, there is a third possibility, which is the one that is the more commonly entertained notion, which is simply that we are being observed by intelligent life forms that evolved somewhere else in the galaxy. They have quarantined our planet to keep us from being agitated by their presence, and they will eventually reveal themselves. I find this an extremely odious notion, especially the part about how much chaos there will be if the truth is ever revealed. This is nothing more than the reassertion of masculine paternalism, its right to keep secrets from the rest of us, its belief that there is a privileged all-male class of people who can be let in on what's really going on, and the rest of us, poor dears, have to be shielded from these tremendously shocking facts. I discussed this once with an entity, and it said to me, well, you know, we've disguised ourselves as an extraterrestrial invasion so as to not alarm people with what's really going on. We're getting close to the end, folks. There is a fourth possibility, which I mention only in the interests of thoroughness, which is that these entities and their vehicles are not spacecraft at all, but are in some sense time craft, and that we may be the tremendous sense of empathy with these quite physically unusual beings may arise out of the fact that we're looking into the faces of our great-great-great-grandchildren, who may be emanating back through time, carrying the message, a message about some sort of future event or situation that lies many centuries downstream from us, but that is of such import that from that point, agents are moving backward and possibly forward through time, spreading the news of some kind of mode shift. This doesn't seem to me to be impossible. However, based on my own experience, which is what I think this thing really comes down to, because what we have in the UFO issue is an official position supported by scientists, whether they be Neanderthal right-wingers or doctrinaire Marxists or whatever, a conspiracy of consensus against the personal experiences of individual human beings who are told, well, what you're saying happened to you can't have happened. You are insane, you are mentally ill, you are mistaken. So what we really have here is a political issue. Which do you believe? Your perceptions, memories, and expectations aided by your intellect, or some kind of utterly abstract, official, doctrinaire, sexist philosophy laid on from above? So I think really what the saucers do, if you accept their presence, is they empower us. They empower us to see science for the shell game that it is, to see the past 400 years of Western culture for the pathetic narrowing of the spectrum of allowable phenomena that it is, to the point where people think that if you can't bang on something with a hammer, it isn't real, which to me is just wild talk. I can't even imagine where that kind of thing is coming from. So I think, and I'll just leave you with this final thought, that in lieu of the repression, and it is a repression throughout this century, of legitimately available ways of exploring the modalities of consciousness, and by that I mean psychoactive compounds, the repression of those compounds and their use by science has created a neurotic energy dynamic in the mass psyche, and the mass psyche has begun to hallucinate because the destiny of human beings is to live in the imagination in the hands of the goddess. And wherever that thrust is impeded, psychopathy will result. There will be neurosis, there will be psychic epidemic, there will be confusion. So I believe that until we form a resolution to conduct an unfettered and mature exploration of the human psychology using all the tools available to us, that the skies of Earth will continue to be haunted by flying saucers. They will continue to be haunted by flying saucers and their denizens because they are symbols of our infantilism, of our sense of loss, of our incompleteness. And we can heal that breach by simply recognizing that the true mystery lies within us. The true mystery is in the mind, and its historical promise is the transformation of our society through the abandonment of reason as it has been narrowly defined by this extremely solar, masculine, paternalistic, materialistic legacy that we are the victims of. Well, I could talk for a long time, but I think that's it in a nutshell. Thank you. Thank you.
Hello and welcome. Our topic today is UFOs, and my guest, Dr. Jacques Vallée, is an expert in this area who during the past 20 years has written numerous books on the subject, including Challenge to Science, The Edge of Reality, Anatomy of a Phenomenon, The Invisible College, Messengers of Deception, and others. Welcome, Jacques. It's a pleasure to have you.
Thank you.
I think one of the interesting things to mention about you is the fact that you were the person that Steven Spielberg modeled a character of a UFO researcher on in his classic movie Close Encounters of the Third Kind.
I think he was intrigued with the idea of a French scientist running around the United States investigating the UFO phenomenon.
You've been looking at this phenomenon for a long time. You've worked closely with Dr. Alan Hynek and other UFO researchers. You've written many authoritative books, and yet your perspective on the UFO issue seems rather unique in the sense that you don't seem to be jumping on the extraterrestrial visitors bandwagon.
That's what was the main point of disagreement with Steven Spielberg. When I met Steven Spielberg, he was about halfway through filming Close Encounters, and we had a long discussion about what UFOs could be. And of course, for him, the main point of the movie was entertainment, and it was appropriate for the UFOs to be extraterrestrial visitors. I think that from my own point of view, I'm going to be very disappointed if UFOs turn out to be nothing more than visitors from another planet, because I think they could be something much more interesting.
Something from another dimension, a space or time?
I think what the UFO phenomenon is teaching us is that we don't understand time and space. Mm-hmm. Here are objects, I think we have to call them objects, that are physical, that interact with the environment, that cause effects on the witnesses, on the psychology and the physiology of the witnesses, and leave traces on the ground, and yet are capable of, appear to be capable of manipulating time and space in ways that go beyond what our physics understands today.
In your books, particularly your most recent book, Messengers of Deception, which is many years old, you suggest that UFOs are deliberately trying to manipulate our subconscious mind, to create a mythology in our culture about themselves, which is one of the reasons that they're both physical and concrete, yet very elusive at the same time. Do you still feel that way?
I think to answer that, I'm not trying to evade your question, but to answer that, you have to step back,
okay,
a little bit farther. What we know today about the UFO phenomenon is considerably more than we knew 20 years ago or 10 years ago. Mm-hmm. And we have to understand it at three different levels. And the first level is the physical level. And all we can say about UFOs at the physical level is that it's a lot of energy in a small space. In the space of this, if we could take the energy of a nuclear reactor and contain it within this studio, for example, you'd have something that would approximate what a UFO does. It's a lot of energy in a small space emitted through light energy and through pulsed microwave energy. The second level is what happens to witnesses, what would happen to you and me if we were close to that source of energy. And again, now we're beginning to understand the physiological and the psychological correlations of a close encounter.
Yes.
And those have to do with a loss of the sense of space, loss of orientation. I've had witnesses tell me we were driving north when they were, everybody knows they were driving south. They were disoriented at the time. Loss of a sense of time, people thinking that only 10 minutes went by and 3 hours went by. Very often effects on the skin, sunburns, I think that was shown in close encounters.
Yes.
Effects on the eyes, going from conjunctivitis to blindness, to temporary blindness in some cases.
And sometimes you've mentioned people have actually been healed of diseases.
There have been cases where after a UFO close encounter, it seems that the healing process had been sped up. Now there are known techniques now using electromagnetic radiation that will heal the fractures, for example, or will heal superficial wounds on the skin, but nothing that would heal as fast as the reported effects.
Yeah.
So we're beginning to understand at least the descriptions, the symptoms of the exposure to whatever UFO is. And then there is a third level, which is where the level I was addressing in Messengers of Deception, which is the social level.
The impact on our culture.
Yes, and the impact on our belief systems. And at that level, and that's something that's very difficult to convey to the believers in UFOs, the believers in little green men from space, that at that level it really doesn't matter whether UFOs are real or not. If enough people believe that something is real, then it is real in its effects.
In terms of its social reality.
In terms of the social reality, in terms of what people act according to their beliefs.
Yeah.
And that opens a question of, really at two levels, could the UFO phenomenon be manipulating us? Could it be a teaching system of some sort? Perhaps something that we are creating ourselves, perhaps a series of images that we are projecting. I think Carl Jung came very close to expressing that idea in one of his books. Or could it be manipulated purposely by people who have the technology to simulate UFO sightings? And people say, well, of course not. Who would do a thing like that? Well, I would remind you that during the Watergate investigation, it was discovered that there was a plan originated in the White House to surface a submarine off the coast of Cuba and paint the second coming of Christ over the island of Cuba using holograms. Which is well within our technology today. The idea was that since there is a large Catholic population in Cuba, they would be so upset by this vision that this would saturate the communication channels, the telephone system in Cuba, long enough for an invasion to take place.
How interesting. I'd never heard of that.
Well, I think that's a classic in psychological warfare, but that kind of manipulation is well understood, and I have personally investigated several apparently genuine UFO cases where there was, in fact, a manipulation. My conclusion, the conclusion of scientists working with me, was that there was, in fact, a manipulation taking place, and that it was not a hoax on the part of the witnesses, but a hoax on the part of somebody much better organized than...
So there are possibly all of these levels going on simultaneously.
Today, with the current technology, that would be possible. One of my interests, as you know, has been to look at ancient sightings, old sightings before World War II, for example, when there is really no confusion with modern technology. And if people described, say, in 1925 or in 1825, a disc flying through the air, then it can only have been very, very few phenomena could have produced it.
And there have been some well-documented sightings going back to the 19th century, for example.
There was, starting in 1896 and going into the spring of 1897, there was a remarkable wave of sightings of airships. Those were described as oval objects flying through the sky with lights on them. And of course, the people in those days could only compare it to dirigibles, could only compare them to airships. And those objects were capable of doing all the things that UFOs do today, including taking off very quickly and making 90-degree turns and landing and occupants coming out of them. And if nothing else, I think this is part of our folklore. This is something that we should be studying as part of our folklore.
What have you been doing since the publication of Messengers of Deception?
Well, I've been really working in two directions. I think that one of the contributions that I can make is trying to develop or to help develop new methodology to deal with this phenomenon. This is not, we don't know where the phenomenon belongs. We don't know if it should be part of psychology or part of physics or part of meteorology or astronomy. We need to develop and it takes a while for science to develop new disciplines around phenomena that don't fit. And I think that's one of the opportunities with the UFO phenomenon. So I've tried to develop methodology that would enable us to deal with the complexity of the reports. And I'm doing this right now using artificial intelligence techniques to develop a very simple screening model. We do know, one thing everybody agrees on, is that 80% of all the cases reported are not UFOs, that they are explainable phenomena.
So if you type the data of these cases into a computer, the computer will probably screen that 80% out.
Exactly. Maybe not the 80%, but if you could just eliminate the 60% and put them into lower priorities, you would save a lot of time of investigators who could go after the high strangeness cases or high priority cases. So that's what I've been doing. As a byproduct of that, you get information on the structure of the phenomenon, the structure of the knowledge about the phenomenon that I think is going to give us some insights into how to approach it. The other thing I've been doing is personal investigations, and I don't belong to any group or to any organization whatsoever. I'm doing this strictly on my own with a small network of friends and scientists and other investigators who help me. And I'm fairly frequently in Europe. I've also traveled to South America and, of course, within the US. And I've tried to investigate cases that had not been reported to the media, had not been reported to UFO organizations.
To avoid possible contamination from other researchers who may have made suggestions.
Exactly. Or simply the pressures on the witnesses themselves to embellish their stories and so on. So I try to go after cases that are reported directly to me.
Have you come up with anything new or interesting in these cases?
Yes. I go after cases where I have continued access to the witnesses and continued access to the site, where I can go back month after month or year after year and continue to follow those cases. One case that I'm especially intrigued with, that I'm continuing to follow, is the case of Dr. X in France.
That's an interesting one, because I know I interviewed you in 1973 about this very interesting case.
Well, it's a case that goes back to 1968. The witness is a medical doctor of some reputation in the south of France, which is why he never wanted his name published in connection with the sighting, so he was referred to as Dr. X. One night he saw some flashes of red light behind the shutters in his house, and so he opened the windows and stepped out on his balcony in the middle of the night and saw two objects that appeared to merge into a single object, and a beam of light went through the balcony where he was standing. Being a scientist, being a medical doctor, he had made a number of observations that during the sighting that enabled the investigators later to reconstruct exactly where the object had been and the apparent size of the object, and the object was apparently very large. One of the interesting sequelae of the incident is that there was a stigma or a marking that developed over his abdomen and also over the abdomen of his son. His son was 18 months old at the time. Over the years, that area of it was like a red geometric shape over the skin, over the stomach. This has been now filmed on recurrent years.
It comes
on
back
on the anniversary
on an annual
of that
basis.
On the anniversary of that sighting. Now
that would be hard to explain in physiological terms, I should think.
There have been several attempts to. Of course, this has been observed by his colleagues in France. One of them wanted to write up a communication to the French Academy of Medicine, except that couldn't be done without naming the witness, and he did not want to be named. I've spoken to several people who continue to follow the case in France, and I met him last year again. The markings continue to appear.
Even after over 18 years.
And there is no, this cannot be explained as psychosomatic. There is an actual change.
Now, when I interviewed you about this many, many years ago, you indicated to me that Dr. X seemed to have acquired certain psychic gifts. In fact, his whole life was changed. His attitudes changed.
That's not unusual. Many of when you investigate a case like this, what you find is usually a witness who is in a state of trauma, has been shocked into, very often their view of themselves, their view of the world around them, their view of the universe has been shattered by this experience. Whether they are religious or not religious, whether they are a cop driving on a lonely road or a PhD or a bank president, I mean, they go through this very shattering experience. And people react, many people react with an awareness of abilities that they didn't know they had before. They will tell you, I don't think the experience itself gave me that ability, but I just became aware that there was more to life than what I thought before.
Well, now, having had time to look back, have these changes been well integrated into his life, would you say?
It's very difficult to answer that question. It's, I know him, I think, fairly well. He has certainly continued to hold to that belief that there was another dimension to life. He's become almost a mystic in terms of his awareness of life and death and the place of man in the universe. At the same time, he has developed a belief system that is difficult for me to accept, in which he has no critical awareness of the phenomenon anymore. In other words, he's accepted it totally in his life, the way a mystic would accept.
He's developed a religious attitude.
Almost a religious attitude, and that's very difficult. I mean, I have to respect that, but it makes it very difficult for a scientist to preserve a distance towards
Except
the phenomenon.
if you look at it maybe as a social phenomenon, as you have in the past. That
Yes,
this may be part of the phenomenon itself.
Exactly. You have to shift your point of view to a social point of view.
How about the case for physical evidence for UFOs? Is it getting better? This is the one thing that we often hear from NASA and from other skeptics, that there really isn't a shred, as they say, of physical evidence.
Well, I brought you a photograph that I recently was in Costa Rica, investigating some cases and talking to investigators there. And I have not done extensive analysis yet on this photograph, but it shows an object.
We can have our viewers look at that.
It shows an object seen over the ocean off the coast of Costa Rica. What is unusual about the photograph is that it was taken by a mapping aircraft with an excellent camera, and it's shown looking down. The camera was obviously pointing down, and the aircraft was flying horizontally at 3,000 meters.
Which is rather low.
Which is, at that altitude gives very, very good detail on the terrain and on and also on the object. Now, the one explanation that we tried to pursue was that the object might have been the rotor of a helicopter flying underneath the aircraft. But with
doesn't look like that.
It doesn't look like that. But nothing else looks like that either. So that's where we are.
I see.
There will obviously be a further analysis done on this.
And you've been to Costa Rica yourself on investigations?
Yes. There is in every country, still today, there is active, Well, this is a phenomenon that goes through waves. It goes through periods of intense activity where clearly all over the world things are relatively quiet. But in practically every country, you will find, if you have to look for those reports, but the reports are there, and the phenomenon continues to be manifesting.
And France, where you're from, is one of the stronger countries in this area, aren't they?
Yes. What is happening, though, is that people are, because of the attitude of the scientific community being very negative on the topic itself, that people are just not reporting what they see anymore. And so we're losing the opportunity to obtain good data about the phenomenon. France may be the exception, because in France, for many years, there has existed an organization called GEPAN, G-E-P-A-N, which is a subset of the French equivalent of NASA, the CNES, the French Committee for Space Studies, and they have funds and a small staff. This is not by any means a large organization, but they do have a budget to investigate UFO reports, especially those coming through the police and the gendarmerie in France. So the procedure is very well established. GEPAN has contacts with every part of the French government and receives all the sightings that...
And I understand in Brazil there was at one time some official acknowledgement of UFOs.
There have been, in fact, I was in France last year at a briefing of GEPAN and the staff of CNES on the UFO phenomenon as seen from the United States. And I was there with Professor Hynek, who since has died, unfortunately, and with a medical doctor who is with the U.S. Air Force and has been very interested in cases like the Dr. X case. And we briefed, there was a very two-day exchange of views with the people at GEPAN. There is a considerable amount of data that has been gathered by those organizations. GEPAN had been approached officially by several countries wanting to use GEPAN as a model to do the same thing in their own countries.
You
several
mentioned
countries in Latin America.
CNES?
CNES. That's the French NASA.
Oh, I see.
They are the people responsible for Ariane, for Ariane Espace, the Ariane rocket.
Oh, yes.
And they are the people responsible for Spotimage, which is a new satellite for exploration of the Earth.
Well, certainly the European space program seems to be making some strides now.
Yes. For a while there was a committee in the Soviet Union that was active in UFO research. I don't know what the current status of that committee is.
We're not hearing a lot from the Soviet Union.
There is active interest. There is an active, as I understand it, an active exchange of correspondence between the Soviet Union and France on this topic.
I thought I heard some years ago an official pronouncement by the Brazilian government that this is an area that should be looked into.
Brazil has always been interested in the phenomenon. There are remarkable cases in Brazil. I had the opportunity to reinvestigate a case in Brazil where two people had died during, I don't want to say as a result, but
during a sighting?
Coincidence with a sighting of a UFO sighted by many people over a wide area. And I had the full cooperation of the police department in Rio, and they have a detective who was detached to continue to study this case and to gather information about that case.
Here in the United States, are there any trends that would distinguish us from the kind of reports you find around the world, or are they all similar?
The reports in the U.S. are absolutely indistinguishable from those in other parts of the world. And that's one of the remarkable things about this.
Because you might otherwise expect
phenomenon.
Cultural differences.
There are very few. There are differences in the way phenomenon is reported, and the way it is treated by the media. In the U.S., the media tends to polarize everything. So either you have to be for or against UFOs. You have to be either you believe in them, in which case you believe in extraterrestrials, or you don't believe in them. And it's very difficult to take a middle position, to say this is a phenomenon that does exist and we don't understand it, and it may be extraterrestrial, but it's probably something else. When you talk to the witnesses in every country, including the US, what they are telling you is that they have seen something that was there, that was part of their reality, part of their physical reality, and yet was capable of appearing out of nowhere or disappearing instantly. And that's why I'm interested. I think it's a challenge to our concept of science, to our concept of technology. My business is technology. I cannot afford to ignore this phenomenon.
Do you anticipate then that there may be some major impact on our culture as a result of this?
I think even if we never understood the UFO phenomenon in the next 200 years, but we only understood how they manipulate the pulsed microwaves, for example, that itself would be a breakthrough in our technology. If we could only duplicate what that phenomenon does.
I haven't heard much about this pulsed microwaves. Is this a new discovery?
It's a convergence of work by several people looking both at the traces left on the ground, the impact on witnesses, the sounds and the visual effects that seem to be produced inside the brain, the heating that is produced on cars or metal or the ground in the vicinity of the object or in the vicinity of the phenomenon. All this strongly suggests pulsed microwave radiation in connection with light radiation.
One of the suggestions, Jacques, that you made in your book, The Invisible College, as I recall, is that the UFOs may be associated with some of the mystical or occult ideas of hidden masters or groups of very wise and beneficent entities that were trying to teach humanity.
I didn't take it that far.
Okay.
I suggested that first, any new phenomenon, even if you go back to the 15th century, when you look at electricity, for example, electrostatics, as it was observed then but not understood, has the potential of being regarded as magical.
Yes.
I think Arthur Clarke said that any technology that we don't understand has to be magic, has to be perceived as magical. I'm paraphrasing badly what he said. I mean, clearly, here is a phenomenon that is very complex and is showing abilities that we cannot duplicate with our current technology. So it immediately calls to mind magic, and occultism.
Yes.
If it also contains something that electrostatics and electromagnetism doesn't contain, the potential of being intelligent. If it is intelligent, then we may not be able to study it with science alone. And science is a way of gaining knowledge based on phenomena that are not manipulated by an intelligence. Yeah. If now there is an intelligence involved, then it becomes much more complex.
It requires a humanistic approach.
And yes, it requires a much more diverse approach from many different disciplines, and it may be that the people responsible for that manifestation understand the impact that the phenomenon will have on us, on our own imagination. And that's one of the speculations that I proposed, was that perhaps the observations of UFOs were similar to a teaching system. But there is another way of thinking about that. Perhaps we're clearly at a time of great potential crisis on Earth. We have a means of destroying the planet, which we've never had before in the history of man. It may be that there is a collective unconscious. If you
that the
follow
UFOs are ourselves, perhaps, or
that we are creating the visions we need to survive in order to transcend this crisis we have, and that there are no UFOs in a manufactured sense.
Well, Jacques, we're out of time now, but it's really been a pleasure, and this is an interesting note to end on. There's so much that could be said about this topic. Thank you very much for being with us.
Well, thank you for giving me the opportunity to pursue this subject with you.
And thank you very much for joining us also.